numbers are registered, so we'll make a start. My name is Justin DeVries, and I'm a colleague of Hannah's at the Rural Planning Co. To introduce ourselves, we are rural planning specialists based in Worcestershire, but working across much of England and Wales. Hannah, who I will pass over to shortly, set up the company called Mole & Co, which was a mixed practice of chartered surveyors back in 2010. Over the last 2 years, our planning department has massively expanded, and so early this year, we split the business and rebranded the planning team from Mole & Co to becoming the Rural Planning Co. We cover all things planning, from agricultural, equestrian, rural businesses, such as glamping or visitor accommodation, and residential planning. One of our specialities is getting consent for rural or agricultural workers' dwellings. Hannah has gained dozens of permissions over the years, and in this presentation is offering her pearls of wisdom to you, hoping to steer you in the right direction. Very usefully, Hannah and her husband Rob are also in the midst of going through the process and are just about to submit an application upgrading their log cabin to build a permanent agricultural workers' dwelling. So she knows and understands the process firsthand. Just before we begin, in terms of housekeeping, Hannah's presentation should last us about 30 minutes. It will be available as a video format afterwards if any of you need to leave before the finish. If you would like to ask any questions, please can I ask you to type the questions into the question box on the right-hand side or your viewing panel, as opposed to raising your hand. I will then ask Hannah as many as I can get through at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand across to Hannah, who will take us through the presentation.
Hi, good evening all. Thank you very much for joining. It's lovely to see so many of you here. So we're going to have a quick romp through how to get planning for an agricultural or rural workers' dwelling. I'm just going to triple check to make sure that we're all okay and nothing is jumping out at me as not working. Hopefully, we do love technology. So just to give you a quick bit of introduction, I think Justin's pretty much covered it all. I'm a director of Mole & Co and the Rural Planning Co, which has been going for 10 years. I've been doing planning for probably 20 years, which is quite frightening. I am really proud that we have a really good success rate. We work really hard to get it right for our clients. We're also very much of the sort of stance that we call a spade a spade. So if we don't think we can get you planning, we'll tell you we don't think you can get you planning, and we won't waste your money and your time. So, but having said that, we definitely don't know everything. There's times when things come to surprise us, but I'll have a quick run through tonight of our experience of ag workers' dwellings and see if we can sort of point you off on the right path. So this is just what we're going to cover. I'm going to cover how it's decided. We're approaching this very much from sort of like a basics perspective, really. So if there are questions over and above the basics, do ask them and I'll cover them at the end. So we're going to talk about how is it decided and who decides it, what are the tests that you need to cover and that you need to be able to demonstrate to justify a dwelling, examples of the type of businesses that can be successful. We're going to quickly talk about the difference between applying for a temporary or a permanent dwelling. We're going to cover what you should expect from the process, how to apply, typical costs and timescales. I've got a couple of frequently asked questions in there as well, point you where to get some more information, and I've just popped a little slide at the end, which is the alternatives to agricultural workers' dwellings. If, having gone through this presentation, you think that you're not going to be able to meet the tests, I've popped on a few alternatives for you to consider. So, carrying straight on then, I'm afraid this is the kind of nerdy bit at the start, and I don't wish to sort of bore you with planning speak, but if I can show you how planning is decided, it will help you sort of understand the process. So a planning application is basically, we are making an application to get permission or seek consent to undertake development of some description. In this case, an application for an agricultural or rural workers' dwelling. So we're asking for permission for that development. It is your local planning authority, normally your local council, and they have the power to grant or refuse that application. So how do the planning officers decide whether to grant or refuse an application? Well, they basically have a rule book, a set of rules which helps guide them as to whether they should grant or refuse. And that is called planning policy. Planning policy is different all over the country. This is the picture on the screen there is our local planning policy, which covers Wychhaven and Malvern Hills. There are other factors which will influence a decision as to whether there is a grant or refuse. But if we start with planning policy, you won't go too far wrong. There are two layers of planning policy. There is national guidance, which is produced by the government, called the National Planning Policy Framework, and that applies to everybody in England. And then each local council or group of councils produce their own local guidance. Now, your job in applying, or our job if we're doing it for you, your job in applying for an agricultural workers dwelling is to do your very best to demonstrate to the council that your proposed development meets the policy contained within their local plan. So that's why it's really important that you can find what's contained within your local plan, that relevant bit of planning policy, because it contains the tests. It literally will set out in black and white what the tests are, what you need to do to meet it, and then you can mold or manipulate your application to meet those tests. So top tip number one is spend time in the planning phase, in the research. Don't charge headfirst into talking to the council. Some people might say, well, just talk to your local council, find out what the guidance is. I personally wouldn't do that, because there are some times that you need to line your ducks up and that you need to kind of maybe just slightly tweak or mold what it is that you're doing before you talk to a planning officer. So there are two themes that you have to meet when you're applying for a planning application. Does it meet the policy in principle? That is, if we're talking through the planning policy, does it meet the tests and the principle of having an agricultural workers dwelling? And secondly, there are practical planning considerations, things like design, siting, highways, drainage, and so on. Our advice in the yellow is always start with the principle. You could have the most beautifully designed house, but if you don't meet the tests, then you won't get anywhere. Things like siting, highways, drainage, most of that, can be overcome or compromised. But if you don't meet those in principle tests, it probably isn't going anywhere. So if we're talking about planning policy, it falls into two separate camps, which we talked about before, national and local. It's consistent across England, but you need to go and find your local planning policy on agricultural workers' dwellings. So the tests set out in the National Planning Policy Framework, in the national there's only one test, which is that you must demonstrate an essential need. Now I'm going to come back to that and what that means in a moment. In local, as I've just said, it varies from council to council. So you need to go and find the relevant policy. I'll talk to you at the end about where to find it. But basically, I'm going to cover the very sort of common and most typical tests in this presentation, but the wording will probably, or most likely, vary slightly from council to council. So the three key tests. The starting point is to say that in the main, councils, and generally speaking the government, don't want housing in the countryside. That is their premise. They want all housing and development directed to cities, towns, villages, because that is what they deem to be sustainable. So the starting point is that they don't want you to have a house in the countryside. So what they do is they set out these quite robust tests that you have to be able to demonstrate in order to be able to overcome and sort of, vary from that point of no. So there's three tests. The first one, if I can make my computer work, is there an essential need for you to be on site? Is that business profitable? and likely to stay so in the longer term? And is there a need for a full-time worker? There are a few others that may crop up in your local council. I'll mention them at the end, but it's these three that I'm going to concentrate on because it is almost certain that these three will be in your local policy. So, number one, the national policy sets out this test, and I can guarantee that every local policy will require this test to be met. So if you only take home one thing from this webinar, it is this point here. And so this is the single most important test. We have to be able to demonstrate that there is an essential need for you to be on site. So the question then, of course, is what is an essential need, and what type of businesses can demonstrate that need? So I'll just give you a second to digest these 4 or 5 lines, but basically there isn't a definition as such. There did used to be actually a long time ago, but they scrapped that. There isn't a single definition that everybody works from. Again, every council could be slightly different. So this is kind of my take on it a little bit. But basically, I think essential is that you need to be there for the proper functioning of your business. The business could not function correctly or properly if you weren't living on site. That could be for reasons of animal welfare, security. It might well be, and is often the case, that it's an enterprise where you need to have close and continual supervision for the enterprise or to the enterprise. And in many instances, that would also mean that you have to have things like out of normal hours inspection. You quite often would have emergency responses or care. So in a lot of ways, you know, the common thing is that is something that is alive and something that is vulnerable. So these are a few of the typical agricultural enterprises that you see fairly frequently meeting the tests. So just to give you an example of how that essential need. So the bottom left one is a calf rearing unit, which is actually ours at home. So with this calf rearing unit, just to give you a couple of examples, those calves, as most of you will know, they are coming with a calf rearing unit. We have an intake of 64 at a time. Quite often it's from 40 farms. You put all those calves together, there's a huge flare up of pneumonia. Those calves need treating within a couple of hours of you spotting those symptoms. The symptoms can be, you know, not eating or lying down. You know, it's high levels of stockmanship to observe that. Now, if you were only visiting the site twice a day, you probably wouldn't observe that. But by living on site and you're in and out the whole time, those are the sorts of things that you can pick up on. The calves come early in the morning. Sometimes they don't come till 10 o'clock at night. Sometimes if they're not feeding or the machine goes off, we have to go out at 11 or 12 o'clock at night. You can start to see the sort of picture that we're building up of the frequency and the need for those very vulnerable animals. Suckler cows, things that are breeding ewes, things that are calving, lambing, anything that is giving birth, generally you can create an essential need from. There's lots of arguments for that, obviously, in terms of if you weren't there, what would the consequences be if you weren't monitoring or looking out for those events. Poultry and pigs, in sort of intensive pigs and poultry, there's always a need for a full-time worker, generally with the size of units that there are, but they're probably less frequent. And away from animals, in some instances, plants actually can be vulnerable. So we got a few years ago now through an application which was a chap that grew quite rare, they were like alpine plants. And he had lots and lots of greenhouses, and in his greenhouse was a manual fogging system which had to be maintained. And if that fogging system just failed or went off in the middle of the night, basically all of his very valuable plants would be ruined within a couple of hours. So we were able to demonstrate that it was essential that he was there on site, because basically that they would die, fail, there would be significant financial problems if that occurred. So that demonstrated an essential need. So those are some typical agricultural ones. Now, rural workers are actually more or less the same. It's still about an essential need. But these can be a little bit looser, so it doesn't necessarily need to be agricultural. I would say that it probably needs to be related or linked in some way to land, probably a sort of rural type of enterprise. It is a rural workers dwelling after all. And importantly, this has to be a business, not a hobby, but we'll come on to that a little bit more. So a few, actually, this is a good question. So I've just popped this in. If you're trying to establish as to whether there is an essential need or not, this is the question to ask yourself. If you were not there in the middle of the night, would something die? Would it suffer? What could go horribly wrong? And would there be a substantial loss, be it in livestock, financial, to the business, if you weren't there in the middle of the night? So that's a good question to ask yourself, and kind of be honest when you're asking yourself that question, because if the answer truly is no, then we might have to look at a different enterprise from which you sort of need to source this essential need. So on to a few examples for rural workers. We have got several workers' dwellings for game rearing, actually. So that is one that definitely fills it. Horses is possible. Horses can be quite hard. We have been successful where they're reasonable sized enterprises. This photograph is a large racing stables, so we were able to get grooms accommodation there. Things like a stud, we have got it for a stud before. If you were sort of an average size livery yard, I think it would probably be difficult, maybe possible, but it depends how you present it. And it actually comes back to the very specific wording in your local authority. For example, some local authorities very specifically, and in fact we have the situation locally here, in Malvern Hills, for example, it does say that security is a reason as to why you can have a worker's dwelling. So you could argue in that scenario that, you know, for security reasons, horses are valuable, so on and so forth, that you need to tack and blah, you know, so on, that you need to be there. Over the border in Herefordshire Council, it explicitly states that security in isolation is not a reason that you can have an agricultural workers dwelling. So that's why I sort of encouraged you at the start, you need to go and find that very specific wording. Alpacas, llamas, there are a few people that have got these. I'm afraid I'm a little bit, I get a bit cross with these because generally, and honestly, it's quite often hobbyists that are trying to convince a planning officer that these alpacas are worth like 50 grand each or something, and they've got to, you know, we've got 6 alpacas, it's vital that we live on site. And so I think it's fairly few and far between that you'll get that. You might, and if it's a genuine business, then perhaps that you can, but and there have been people that have been successful in that, but I would be wary of that because it's very difficult to demonstrate that you've got a viable long-term business. But some alternative livestock might meet it. Basically anywhere that you've got slightly unusual animals, so farm parks, things that takes a lot of care or more unusual type of you know, veterinary medicine needs, perhaps, that sort of thing would probably, or I know that those we can justify an essential need for those. And we have been successful for catteries and dog kennels, but they do have to be of a certain size, and there's a few sort of nuances with that. But again, you need to be, if you need to be on site for security or the welfare, then it may be possible on those sorts of enterprises. So that sort of more or less parks the essential test. We're going to move very quickly on to the financially sound. So there's lots of wordings of this. So this is test number 2. It's basically asking to show that the business is profitable and that it is likely to stay so in the long term. They want to see that it's viable. They don't want it to be a hobby. You won't get it if it's a hobby. So we need to demonstrate the enterprise to which the need relates is going to be or does operate as a commercial enterprise and a business. So how do we do that? If you are an existing or an established business and have been trading for a number of years, we can submit copies of the accounts. you can ask for it to be made private so that it's not put on the website and stuff, but you submit copies of the accounts, you can show the profitability, and that counts as a demonstration of the financial soundness of the business. If you are a new business or the enterprise is new, then what we have to do is we have to submit sensible forecast budgets. Now, budgets is something that can be a little bit loosely applied. So generally speaking, you can kind of semi-do what you want a little bit with budgets within reason. If I'm going to just tell you briefly about the difference between temporary and permanent in a moment, but if you get permission for a temporary dwelling, which normally happens and is normally the case for a new business, the one thing that you do have to do is plan your accounts from the start. So if you're a new business, you're going for a temporary permission, you generally are given something like 3 years, at which point, for a temporary permission, at which point they're expecting you to probably, in most instances, upgrade to a permanent dwelling, or if it doesn't work, remove the caravan or the mobile home. So when you're at the start of that process, at the start of your 3 years, it is very important that you make sure that you plan your accounts and you plan that you will be in profit by the end of your temporary permission, because if you aren't, you are not going to be able to get a permanent dwelling. So don't forget that accounts are generally prepared by an accountant, and they're prepared to minimize your tax. So things like depreciation are added in. So that reduces your profits, which is good for tax, very bad from a planning perspective. So talk to your accountant, tell them what you're looking at doing. There are some ways of legally manipulating the accounts if necessary. But do that with plenty of time, because if you're suddenly 2.5 years in, suddenly realise that you've got to make the application for the permanent dwelling, you're already probably halfway through your 3rd year by then, and it's very difficult to make changes. So plan it from the start. So the 3rd test is that the need relates to a full-time worker. So this is an interesting little exercise. There are some local authorities that won't actually require you to demonstrate this. As a rule of thumb, we tend to put it in most of our applications because it helps to sort of demonstrate and kind of give a robustness to the application. There are different ways to demonstrate it. I'm going to give you one of the ways, which is called the standard mandate method. And again, it can be manipulated quite legitimately to suit you. So for those of you that were agricultural college, this would have been a staple in the bag at some point, the John Nix pocketbook. Buried in the back of the John Nix pocketbook is this page called Standard Mandates. Now, I took a terrible photo of it, and I don't know whether any of you can see it or not, but what it basically does is it attributes a number of mandates per type of animal in the normal kind of farming environment. So if you can see the top line, for example, dairy cow is 4 standard mandates. So what that is saying is that every dairy cow in a normal dairy enterprise will take or will absorb 4 people's work, 4 standard mandates in a year. So they apply that to other sorts of animals. So common ones, beef cow, suckler cow, that is 1.35 standard mandates. Ewes, skipping down a little bit, lowland ewes is half a standard mandate. So what that is saying is that if you have 1 sheep, it would take you half a day if you added it all up that you needed to do in a year. You very much could argue that with sheep, but this is your standard mandate. So what we can do, if this is like a normal agricultural enterprise, is that we can create kind of standard mandate calculations. Now, this is very much an example. This isn't actually how we would do it, but I'm just giving it you to demonstrate. So if we were to say, for example, look at suckler cows, and you had 80 suckler cows, they are 1.35 standard mandates each, which gives you a total labour requirement for your 80 cows of 108 standard mandates. Assume that you finish all of those progeny, that follows through to your 100 to your 1.10. And let's say alongside that, you've got a breeding flock of 500 ewes. you've got which are half a day each. And then within that breeding ewes, it's a bit complicated because that includes baby lambs. But let's say you finish half of your lamb production later, over 6 months of age, so 500 to pluck a figure, and that gives you another 150 days. Now, in a normal calculation, we would add on things like any cereals, we'd add on haymaking, grassland maintenance, all sorts of things, general management. So I've just given you a very abbreviated version of this, but in that scenario, it comes up to 594 days. Now, the accepted full-time worker is considered to be 275 days a year. So very broadly speaking, you divide 594 by 275, and this enterprise, your 80 suckler cows and your 500 breeding ewes would be enough work for 2.1 full-time workers. So in this scenario, it would now meet the test of demonstrating there is enough work for a full-time person. It's worth noting that there will be lots of enterprises with no standard man days, and sometimes they should be different. If you can justify it and show how you deviate from this, then you can basically make it up. But you can make it up to reflect the specific enterprise. But this is a very commonly accepted way of demonstrating the full-time need calculation. Back very quickly to temporary or permanent dwelling. Now, if you want to build a permanent dwelling, a house, you have to be able to demonstrate the business is profitable and is likely to be so in the long term. So it is only likely to be that you can go straight for a house if you have an established business. So if you have trading accounts that we could show are profitable, in that scenario, perhaps it might be the second or third dwelling on a holding, for example, then you could go for a permanent dwelling. If you are starting a new enterprise, then we have to do your budgets, like I said before. So you do budgets to demonstrate that we've planned it to be profitable. But what they will do is they will give you a temporary permission, so you can have a temporary home of some description for, say, 3 years. That allows you to establish the business, run the business, and then you can come back in 3 years or so to apply for the permanent dwelling once you go back up to that first point of now you've got the accounts and you can demonstrate the profitability. I suppose that the only other thing to say about that is on the caravan, it has to meet the definition of a caravan. So it could be a cabin, a lodge, a static. It doesn't have to be a caravan. It has to meet the definition of a caravan. And if anybody wants to know what that is, don't ask me right now because I won't be able to remember most of it. But I can certainly let you know. There's a size, there's a height, and it's got to be built in so many pieces and so on. Other tests. Oh crumbs, how have we done that? Hang on. Other tests. The various local authorities will have other tests in their planning policy. So until you look at the planning policy, you won't know what's in it. Some of them will ask you to demonstrate that there are no other locally available dwellings for sale. If you've got an ag-tied dwelling at the end of your lane that is for sale and nobody's bought it, it would be very difficult for you to get one if that was the scenario. There must be no other buildings available for conversion. They would always prefer a conversion of a barn or something if possible. Sometimes they will insist that the dwelling is commensurate, i.e. sort of applicable, appropriate in size for the enterprise. And sometimes they have specific tests on or requirements on where you can site the dwelling. So those are the 3 tests that we've covered, and the last slide just showed a few of the other ones that may pop up. But certainly the essential need, the financial, and the full-time worker are the 3 things that you really need to plan and concentrate on. So as I said at the start, there are a few other things that they will take into account, and these are what we sort of call planning matters. And these need to also be acceptable to the council. Now, this is more relevant to a house, to a permanent dwelling, than it is a temporary. So things like, and I won't dwell on this, but siting, location, how big it is, the design of it. Is it contemporary? Is it traditional? Where is it going to be sited? Is there going to be any landscape impact of that siting? Where's the water going to go? Where's the foul water going to go? If you're building it next to a listed dwelling, what is the heritage impact on that listed dwelling? But I wouldn't concern yourself too much with all of these, because generally they are overcomeable if you can meet those principles that we've already talked about. I just wanted you to be aware of them, that they will come into play when you make an application for a permanent dwelling. I just want to run very quickly through a few frequently asked questions. So, one question that we get asked quite regularly is, we've already got a farm, we've got an established business, and can we get permission for a second or third dwelling on the farm? So historically, you used to have to show that there was enough work for that second, third or fourth worker. So going back to those tests where we showed on that example that there was 2 full-time workers, in that scenario, you possibly, if there was more than one, and for each subsequent one, another worker. I have never tried it where you've literally got 1, 2, 3, 4. I think that would be pushing it too much. But if you were sort of on some dairy farms, quite conceivably up to 6, 8, 10, on our calf rearing unit, it gets to about 6. 6, 8, 10 full-time workers, because of course you can manipulate the figures a little bit, then I'd feel reasonably comfortable about going for your second or third dwelling, perhaps. I wouldn't want it to be necessarily 1 worker, 1 house. However, fairly recently, the government changed the wording in the National Planning Policy Framework to also include some scope for a second dwelling or third dwelling if for a person that is taking financial control of a business, i.e. next generation. So in this situation, even if you intend to put mum and dad or grandparents into a bungalow that you're looking to build, it's probably better to say that it's you, that you're taking on the financial control of the business, you need it, and therefore it's demonstrating that you should be able to, in theory, get a second or third dwelling on that basis. The next question we get asked is, can an arable farm or, say, rearing store cattle meet the essential test? And my answer is not very easily no. It's possible occasionally on very big units. Whenever there is animals, there is always some degree of animal welfare test necessary. But with store cattle, as we all know, in all fairness, you probably could look at them mainly twice a day, and that would be sufficient. But I think if you had sufficient numbers, then rearing store cattle could probably meet the test. Arable is very difficult because really, whilst it's convenient to live on the farm, you could very much argue that there is no essential need for you to be there. Nothing is going to die if you're not living on site. The third question is, what are the implications of getting a condition or section 103 put on the property or the farm? So if you are successful in getting a permanent agricultural workers dwelling built, then every time they will want to put on a occupancy condition which is attached to the planning approval. So the condition will be something like that the occupation of the dwelling must be somebody who is employed either primarily or principally employed in agriculture, or the rural worker if you've gone down that route. So there's an occupancy condition, and generally speaking, the effect of that, if it's genuinely for you, you're in the business, you're living there, for most people that's no great shakes. But what it does do is it reduces the value of a property by 25 to 35%. So from a practical implications point of view, it can be more difficult to get a mortgage and things. But it's still, for most people, obviously worth doing because it is affecting, you know, it is genuinely a positive improvement on the lifestyle of being able to live on the farm. Section 106s are becoming less common. They are legal agreements which can sometimes either back up the condition or sometimes, in some instances, like tie land to the building or to the dwelling rather. My advice would be to fight those. If anybody is trying to put a section 106 on, do your very, very utmost to not allow that to happen, or to avoid it if you ever possibly can. They're horrible little things, Section 106s, and they can be very timely and very costly to get them off. It can also be quite inhibiting in terms of selling land, dividing it for future generations and all sorts of things. So try and avoid a Section 106. And then last frequently asked question, probably off record, how truthful do you have to be with numbers of animals? How much room for sort of manipulating the presentation of an enterprise is there? So what I will say is that if you asked us to do a planning application for your agricultural workers dwelling, I will come, sit around your table, have a cup of tea with you, and I will say, John, how many suckling cows have you got? And I will write that down, and I will do the calculations based on what you tell me. I don't go around your fields and count them. So to some degree, there is some degree of flexibility there. And similarly, we have used averages sometimes. So we've had a case once or twice where they used to have a lot of stock. They don't now, for whatever reason, personal reasons, whatever, have as much. And what we've done is we've said something like that there has been, on average, 1,000 breeding ewes there for the last 5 years. We're not lying, but we're just sort of, tweaking it to make sure that we are presenting this in the right way. In terms of budgets and things, we can be looking at, it is infinite, because things like lambing percentage, you could be at 1 or 1.2, or you could be at 1.8 or 9, and that could be the variance of a huge amount of animals and going into your budget. So, in a normal year, what's a normal year? There is a degree of flexibility. So I'm certainly not saying that you go very far away from what is happening. And I'm pretty sure that even a planning officer will know the difference between a sheep and a cow, maybe, but there is a degree of presenting the argument in the right way. So what is the process of applying? It's basically loads and loads and loads of paperwork, so forms, block plans, location plans, elevations if you're going for a permanent dwelling, the design and access statement that talks about why you designed it like you have, how it fits into the area. You might have to do water management, you might have to do drainage statements. In some instances, you'll be required to do sort of technical supporting surveys, things like ecological, just to make sure that you're not going to dig up a badger or squash a newt or something when you're digging out your foundations. But the important part for an agricultural worker's dwelling, which doesn't apply to many other applications, is the business justification statement. And in a moment, if my technology will allow, I will show you just how sort of robust a document that should be, because that is literally the whole document, the statement telling them everything about your business, all the things that could go wrong if you weren't there, and showing how you meet the policy. Sometimes it can be really beneficial sometimes it's essential to send supporting information like the accounts, but also there's things that you can really benefit from sending, like supporting letters. For our calf rearing unit, for example, we send a contract that we have with our sort of suppliers and the people that they go to, just to show that it is a very genuine enterprise, and that we are doing the numbers that we've said we do. In terms of timescales, I would probably allow 6 months for an application from the time that you start the ball rolling or come to us. It could well be that. It's generally sort of 8 to 12 weeks with the council. You need a bit to prepare it, and then you need a bit of leeway within that. So to be on the safe side, probably allow 6 months. That doesn't allow for an appeal. If it goes wrong and we don't manage to get it through at application stage and you want to go to appeal, you probably could allow quite comfortably another 6 to 12 as it stands at the moment to appeal. It's they're very, very slow. The last thing that I just wanted to mention is at the bottom of there, sometimes a third-party consultant is involved. Now, what the process is that you submit all of this information to the council, and in some instances, in some councils, it is a planning officer that will decide whether you meet the tests or not. in some councils, and it's just their policy or not, in some councils, they send your application off, including all of the justification statements, to a third-party consultant. So another person like me that can look at it objectively with the business hat on to see if you meet the tests. Now, if there is a third-party consultant involved, it is very, very important to do two things. One is that you actually have to pretty much sort of get close to what you're saying you're doing, because the third-party consultant will be fairly switched on and definitely will know the difference between a sheep and a cow and tease anything out. And I suppose the other thing is really just that you'll end up quite often paying for that third-party consultant, which could be another 400 or 500 quid on top of the cost. Yes, it can be very convoluted when that third-party consultant is involved, and quite often nowadays they are. So just be mindful that that is part of the process. We are nearly finished. Oh, I keep doing that, sorry. What should planning cost? I'm giving you an absolute ballpark. If you were to ask us to do the planning application for you, we're not cheap. It's not cheap. It's not a cheap process. We write planning justification statements that are probably 20 pages long and specific to your enterprise. So we charge something between 2,000 and 4,000, and if I'm absolutely honest, it's closer to the top end of that more often than not, because this is probably one of the hardest things that we do for people. It is a hugely it's difficult to achieve, and it has to be very robustly done. So we charge a reasonable amount of money so as that it is done hopefully right first time. So if you're going to pay a consultant, expect to pay something in that sort of region of 2,000 to 4,000. You need to pay a planning fee to the council. That's normally around £500. If you're going for a permanent dwelling, you'll need to have full elevations and floor plans. And so it depends how fancy you go on that as to what that will cost you, but you could probably 2,500 would get you a decent set of plans. And occasionally you'll need additional surveys. Most instances you won't need those, but I've just popped them on just so as that you're aware they may happen. Now, I said at the start, go and find your planning policy. Now, I've just given you a couple of screenshots here so as that you can go and find it, because this is the starting point for you to go and find that. So I've given you the example of Cotswold District Council. Generally speaking, it's always who you pay your council tax to. If you don't know who the local authority is, you can get it on the gov.uk website. So you can just type in your postcode and it will tell you who the local authority will be. Then if you go onto, say, your local council's website, you'll see virtually on the home page, in every situation will be a little box which says planning and building. So you click on there and it will go through, and what you're looking for is planning policy. So find that. There's, as you can see, there's always loads and loads of documents. Find planning policy, find the local plan or core strategy. It's Cotswolds, it's about 300 pages long. And then somewhere buried in that 300-page document will be a paragraph about this big on planning policy for rural or agricultural workers' dwellings, and that's what you need to go and find. So for those tech-savvy ones amongst you, if you open up that document, I would advise doing a Control F and try and find it that way rather than scrolling all the way through. Sometimes the contents page will help you out. But basically, go and find that document, because that is where it will set out the tests to you in black and white that applies to your local area. And then from that, that is what you need to work up your plan as to how to get your dwelling. If you want to do an extra bit of research, most local authorities have got a search facility, so as that you can go, for example, on this one, where it says at the bottom, enter a keyword, you could write rural workers dwelling, agricultural workers dwelling, or just workers dwelling, and find some other examples in your area, because you would be able to read their justification statements and see how they've done it and what the officers and planning officers thought to theirs. This is my last slide. I realise that I've gone way over time, so I'm really sorry, everyone. I just wanted to highlight to you that agricultural workers' dwellings are not for everybody. Meeting those tests is not straightforward. So occasionally there are alternatives in terms for living on the farm which you might not think about. Barn conversions now include something called a Class Q, which doesn't have to be traditional brick barn conversions. It can be, miraculously, sheds, basically sheds. And we have managed to get quite a few of these little sheds through. Let me show you some more. All of those we have managed to convert to houses. So things where basically your cattle house could become your house. So if you don't think for any reason that an agricultural or rural workers dwelling is up your street, it might be that you have a surprising shed that you could apply for. Now, what's better than that is that if you don't fancy converting your shed or living in your cattle house, or the cattle are still there, we have recently been successful in effectively changing it from a shed to a house. So you get the conversion, and then you go back to the council and say, oh, it looks like a shed, it's not very pretty, can we have a nice house please instead? That may also be possible now. Number 3 is in some instances under permitted development you can get a mobile home in the curtilage of the main house. That might not be a long-term plan but potentially more of a temporary solution for people. And then planning policy in most instances is relatively supportive of either extensions, residential extensions, or splitting a main house if that is also an alternative for you. So finishing off on the Class Qs, they are amazing at creating something out of nothing. All of these that we're talking about, easily worth 150,000 each. They're a shed as a plot, easily, probably more. So it can be amazing at creating something out of nothing, but it's very finely balanced from a planning perspective. So talk to a consultant. I would say that in out of Class Qs, 9 times out of 10, we have suggested changes before you go to the council. So again, don't jump in, talk to a consultant on that one, but they can be surprising ways of creating accommodation on the farm. So I'm finished, and I'm really, really sorry that it's gone quite so over. I hope that it has been useful for you. Justin, is there any questions that has come out that you want me to cover?
Yes, sorry, I'm desperately noting them down quickly. Just say, well, thank you very much. I think we can all appreciate how complicated the subject is. It's definitely not straightforward. But yeah, the pearls of wisdom I think you've given all of us tonight have been really useful in trying to understand really where we need to be going when it comes down to looking at rural workers' dwellings. I have noted down a few questions for us. Some of the questions, we're not going to be able to get around to all of them, but we'd really like to hear from you. You're more than welcome to email them to us. We'll have a more in-depth look at them. Some of them might be quite individual to your region, to your area. Would need us a bit more time for us to go through that with you and have a look. But yeah, some of the questions I picked out so far, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you. When you talk about one question I had a second ago, when you talk about profitability, demonstrating profitability, how profitable does it actually need to be? Will they pick up if you are paying yourself the minimum from the profits, the minimum base profit?
So generally, the sort of accepted rule of thumb is that you have to be, if you have to be profitable in at least 1 out of the last 3 years. I always feel slightly nervous about only being profitable in 1 out of 3, and I would feel much better by being profitable in 2 out of 3, even if it's just a small profit in one of those. So generally speaking, we're looking at 3 years of accounts to submit. If I could wave a magic wand and say, this is what I want your accounts to look like, let's say hypothetically you're starting with a temporary dwelling and we've got 3 years and now you're going to apply for a permanent. I would say it's perfectly acceptable to lose money in your first year. And in fact, I'm sure that it is almost, that is almost certainly going to happen. So if I wave my magic wand, it would be probably a loss in the first year, a small profit in the second year, 2, 5,000, 8,000, something like that maybe. But I think for your third year, you need to be able to show somewhere close to what is basically a worker's salary. Now, I don't necessarily mean an agricultural worker's salary, I mean a normal person's worker's salary. So don't forget, planning officers are, you know, civil servants, and you know, they're probably on a nice big chunk of money. And what might be usual in the agricultural industry to have 12 or 15 grand, they might turn around, I think, maybe fairly legitimately, and say that's not enough, especially if you're looking to build a house out of it. So again, if I could wave that magic wand, loss in the first year, small profit, 2, 5, 8 grand in the second year, and I think you want to be 20-ish or a little bit more if you can be by the third year. Don't forget that after you've got your planning granted, you never have to be profitable again. You just literally have to get it in one of those 3 years. Does that answer the question?
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much. If so in the first year you get your temporary dwelling permission granted, then 3 years later you get the permanent dwelling. Are you still allowed to keep that temporary dwelling that you got in the first year?
So you're allowed to keep the temporary dwelling for as long as you build the house. There's a little bit more to it than this, but broadly speaking, you are allowed to keep the temporary dwelling to live in whilst you build the house. And then technically, once you've built the house and have moved into it, the temporary dwelling should be removed from site at that point, unless you reapply for it as something else, whether it's a holiday let or for another worker or something. But in theory, that should then be removed.
Okay. Oops. An interesting question I had is, how big a dwelling can I get? Is there a size limit?
That will very much, good question, very much depend on the local council. So in some councils, there is a given amount. So the example that I showed you at the start in the South Worcestershire, which covers Malvern Hills and Wychavon, just to use our local examples, it says that you can have a maximum of 150 square metres. Now that is floor space, not footprint. So footprint is the footprint, the whole ground floor area. Floor space is both stories. So that's not an overly big house. That is 75 per floor or thereabouts, which is only really just a sort of small 3-bedroom house. So they very specifically state 150 square metres. In that particular scenario, the local policy says that if you can financially demonstrate that you can justify a bigger house, then you possibly can get one. And I would think that the way, we haven't tested that yet, but I would think that the way to do that is to basically show that you're more profitable than other similar enterprises, or that you have got a really good profit, you know, maybe 30, 40, 50 grand plus or something that could justify the building of a bigger house. Now, you know, if anybody's able to get to 30, 40, 50 grand profit out of agricultural rural worker in 3 years, then happy days. But that's the sort of test. Some others just say that it must be commensurate with the size of the enterprise, so that's a little bit more open. But generally speaking, it is what sort of feels right, really. But you know, push it a little bit. Maybe if you're feeling in a fairly strong position, you can push it a little bit. The other way of testing it is that if you're going for your permanent dwelling, you could do an outline application first, which basically bags the approval, bank that, you've got the approval, they can't go back on that now, so you've established the principle. Then you can go back in with the reserved matters. You could go back in for a big house if you wanted, you know, push the boundaries a little bit, and then all you're doing is fighting over the nitty-gritty with the council of the size. You sort of bag the principle of it, and now you can have a bit of a scuffle with them over how big you can get it.
Brilliant. Okay, I think we've got time for, should we try 1 or 2 more questions more? And
let's try 1 or 2 more then, if people can drop off if they want to, can't they?
Absolutely. Yeah, let's go for 2 more questions. Interesting one. Someone's asking whether they can use the profits from another side. So they've diversified their farm. They're wondering if they could use the profits from their glamping, this glamping side diversification, in to demonstrate the need for rural workers dwelling.
If the question is, will that help the financial sustainability of it? It's a really tricky one to answer, actually. I would work on the basis, we have had it, I would work on the basis that the financial viability has to come from the enterprise, which is the essential need. So I would say that if you had the scenario, so we had the scenario where there was a small poultry enterprise and they were quite happy that they had an essential need, and alongside it they did contracting, but the contracting actually brought in the larger part of the profit, well, the revenue each year. And actually the local authority on that one took the view that the enterprise which gave the essential need, i.e. the poultry, was not viable in isolation, and so they didn't accept that. I think you can potentially argue that actually, as on most farms, diversification is an essential part of a sustainable farming enterprise. And I think, again, it will depend on the local authority, a little bit on the planning officer, how you position it. So I wouldn't like to say, yes, you can depend on a glamping income to create, to sort of demonstrate the financial viability. I think that it wants to be fairly chunky coming out of the essential need. But if you are bumping up from, let's say, something that's viable and profitable in the farming enterprise, and that you've now got some cream on the top from the glamping, that might help you with, say, for example, the size or something like that. It can just help, I don't know, oil it a little bit, but I wouldn't like to rely on it.
Okay, final question. This has been asked, we've been asked whether it's possible to move a rural agricultural worker's dwelling. I assume that means if the dwelling is temporary, so you've got permission for the dwelling to be in one place, but actually you'd prefer it to be in a much more...
yes, yeah, it is. So when it comes to the siting of the permanent, again, some councils will be a little bit more lax or a little bit more flexible as to where they want it sited. It doesn't want to be miles away from the buildings or wherever your essential need is. But if, you know, because for most part, you do want to stay living in the temporary whilst you build the other. So I think it's absolutely fine to do that. You probably don't want to be a long way away, but it would be fine to have an alternative site. And actually, when you come to the permanent, you just kind of have to demonstrate why that is the best site afresh anyway, really, because they don't really care too much about where you put the caravan that's going. So really, it's just about thinking about where the house is going to go and is that the best site for it.
Right, fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry we've not been able to get around to all the questions, but please do email us and we can deal with and help you out individually. Some of them we'll need to a bit of research, I suspect. But once again,
Justin, just butting in for a second, just very quickly mentioning that if anybody wants to chat about their scenario any further, we do free initial consultations for everybody, so there's no obligation, no charge. You can book it on the homepage of the Rural Planning Co website. So if you want to do that, we can talk about your scenario, like I say, free of charge with you in the first instance. So, and you can book that directly on our website. So if that helps and you want to sort of pick it up and take it any further, the offer's there for that.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, that's a good offer. Well, we hope you all really enjoy the presentation, and that's given you a sort of clear guidance of how to move forward with an application. Yeah, exactly. As Hannah said, if you'd like us to review the situation, you know, please send us an email or book a free consultation through the website. Of course, if you need help, we'd love to chat. But the purpose of undertaking this webinar was very much to help you understand the process and move you forwards, which we hope it has done. So at this point, we'd like to draw it to a close, and thank you all for listening and coming along this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.